Okay, I will get started. So here are the responses I got from you all, and I'm going to deal with them in order of the largest number of people that asked for each topic. So the first one was about forming a critical inquiry question. So I wanted to start with why this is hard when you're just starting out, when this is the first time you've had to do something like this. So if you look over here to the right, you think you understand what gravity is, and so you see a picture of an apple falling, you say, okay, that's gravity. Maybe you don't think you know what it is, so you go on Google and you search in gravity, and it gives you a definition like this: represents the attraction between objects, blah blah blah. The thing is that in physics classes, when students come into the classroom, physics professors are always surprised by all the things that students get wrong about gravity. And the basic bottom line is that physicists don't know what causes gravity. So it's not so much that people believe the wrong thing, it's that they don't acknowledge that they don't know what the thing is that they believe gravity is, right? So physicists are people who study things like gravity and say, well, we don't really know what gravity is. But people who don't study gravity seem to think they know what it is, just based on their common sense or their everyday experience, and those are wrong. And so what a critical inquiry question is it's trying to examine the information that you don't know. And so you kind of already know the things you know, but then there's this big open space of things that you don't know. And so this is really what a critical inquiry question is. It's examining, what don't I know about this topic? And so this is something that your professors, the research professors, those of us who are research professors, we do this all the time, and so it's fairly simple for us. But if you've never done it, or you haven't done it for a long time, then it's going to be difficult. So what I want to do is try to help you go from confusion to clarity, right? So you should be confused, right? You should even be confused about, well, I thought I knew what gravity was, and now my professor's telling me I don't, right? You should be confused about that. But we want to get to a position where you're no longer confused. And the idea is that you're able to do that through your writing. So it kind of starts with this problem of duality. So on the one hand, you think knowledge is in your head, and that's fine. That's helpful, it's convenient, it's a nice metaphor for thinking about thinking, really. But in reality, there's no such thing as knowledge in your head, right? If there was knowledge in your head, then there'd be no place for your brain. And your brain isn't made for thinking. Your brain is to keep you breathing, to eating, right? Those kind of things, keeping you alive. And so you really have this very difficult task then of trying to pull out information in a way that's not real, right? You can't really literally open your brain up and pull out this piece or that piece. And so why we kind of start with the critical inquiry question is because of this difficulty, because of this confusion. And so it's always best, right as you're beginning to start an inquiry question, to ask yourself, what can I best answer right now? Okay, you've spent almost 3 months in this class, so you have some knowledge, you've gained some understanding about things. So write yourself a question that you can write the answer to based on that knowledge. And so that's the very kind of first step, is just kind of, what is it I know? Now I'm going to ask myself a question about that particular knowledge. And it should be something that you can answer. So let me just try and see if that kind of makes sense, or if anybody wants to offer a critical inquiry question of their own, and we'll see what we can do.
It makes sense.
Anybody else?
Professor, can you give an example of a critically inquiry question?
You're very tricky. I was going to ask you to do the same thing. I mean, what would be a good inquiry question for the gravity example? I mean, this one's good because we take this for granted, right? We don't think about this a lot. Most of us aren't in physics classes, and so what would be a good one now that we know we don't know anything about gravity? What would be a good critical inquiry question? silence, right? So this is right. What do you know, right? What do you know about gravity? I mean, just looking at this picture, what do you know? Anybody? If you're too shy to talk on audio, right, you could put it in the chat. What's one thing you know or you think you know about gravity? I think you're close, Daisha, but the problem is can you best answer that question? Do you think you have information about all the creatures on Earth? Right, so this is kind of the point, right? Critical inquiry is not research. So what's a question you could answer right now? I think it's really close to that one. Not how does gravity affect creatures on Earth, but how does gravity affect you personally? That you know. That you can...
Well, because it keeps us staying on the ground. Keeps us on the ground.
So that's false, but that, right? So a good inquiry question would be something like, why do I think that gravity keeps me on the ground? And you see, I'm seeing more. And Zaisha said, how does it feel? Can we feel it? Right. So instead of generalizing, instead of trying to ask a question that's general outside of your experience, it's better to ask one about your own experience and things you actually know about firsthand. You could say something like, to your answer, I would say something like, well, I feel like gravity keeps me on the ground because when I jump, I don't jump as high as I'd like. So that would be kind of a good question to try to answer because you have knowledge about that thing. So let's see if somebody can type something or talk out loud about what would be a good inquiry question for this class that you know you can answer.
Can it also be the question that we...
Sorry, you cut off.
Oh, no, sorry, I was going to ask, can it also be the question that we asked the question that we came up with when we first came in this class?
I think that's a very good question. I think that's a good way to start the paper.
Yeah, because honestly, one of the questions that inquiry questions I have is the one that I asked when the semester first began. And
yeah.
I used that to...
Now the exception, of course, would be, if you asked a question in the first week and you still don't think you know the answer to it, that might be a good idea to maybe try to break down the question. But if you feel like you've got a good answer that you didn't have on week one, then that's a very good way to start a critical inquiry question. I think also Daisha's approach to, how does the criminal justice affect me personally? You should be able to then use knowledge from the course to answer that question.
Professor, what about, is it important for me personally to be involved, like in politics, or be, what's the word? Civically engaged?
I think that's a good way to start, and then it'll just, like maybe the next slide we could talk about what that would look like. I think it's the same thing for Daisha's question about the amendments. I think it gets a little complicated in those type of, right, in those types of questions. Because those are both value judgments that you're making. Like, is it important for me to get involved? How do the amendments serve me, right? These are things that require value statements. So I think this is good. Again, at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to type something up into the Google form. So, you just want to be thinking about something simple. I mean, that's what I had said last week, is try to keep this part simple. This is not the hard part of the paper. It's hard to get started because you just haven't done it very often. But there aren't wrong answers. There's just questions that make your life harder, and there's questions that make your life easier.
So can I share one of the questions that I came up with?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so one of the questions, like similar to like I said, why should judges be politically motivated instead of neutral?
So I'm gonna get into this in a second, but so the only part of that question I don't like is the word should.
Okay.
And so it should be, how are they politically motivated instead of neutral?
Okay.
Okay, and so I'll just jump in because when you ask the word, when you say should, or when you involve value judgments of any kind, that's a normative paper. So those papers are typically, sadly, sometimes criminal justice professors have you write these papers. It's not a good idea. But these are typically in like an ethics class, a philosophy class. So sometimes I get, nursing students, and they usually have a paper like this in their medical ethics class, right, where they're arguing whether they think somebody should be able to commit suicide and whether the medical system should help them, right? That's a normative question. It's asking about norms. It's asking about values. And so analysis is not normative. It's not talking about what should or shouldn't be. It's talking about what is, right? So it's much more realistic. It's not talking about an alternative reality. It's talking about the one we live in now.
So can we go as simple as to say, what did we learn from the class? Like, what did we take away from the class? Could that be a legit question?
Not only would that be legit, that would be the genius thing to do. And I think, the next question would just be how do you do it? So I just want to make sure everybody's clear then on, because a lot of you make this other mistake. Some of you are making the mistake of normative, the value judgments, but others you're making the formalism mistake. So formalism is when you just look at the text of a reading. So a lot of times in English class they'll ask you to do this, right? The reading will be about immigration, and they'll say, what did Jan say about her immigrant experience? And you look at the text of the class, and it's just the formal writing, right? It's like kind of a book report style of writing. And again, there's not really any analysis in that. You're really just kind of copying and pasting. And in this case, sometimes, it goes to, you read a law. This is what makes me nervous about the amendments one, right? So people might say something like, the First Amendment serves me, and then you look at the text of the First Amendment and you think that you've got the right answer, but you'd have to read at least probably 12 to 15 legal cases to be able to analyze that claim of the First Amendment, and you'd find out the First Amendment doesn't serve you, and it's actually not even for you, it's for journalists. And so, it just makes me nervous that you're not going to be able to do, you won't be able to find material from this course that would help you answer that question, because it's a formal question. It's not one that's based in socio-legal analysis. So this is why picking picking a lane, right, when you're on the street, right? Sometimes people are going from lane to lane to lane when they're driving. You just need to stay in one lane, right? Pick a lane, pick a theme, and just stick with it. And so I think that the first place to start is your standpoint. Who are you? And for some of you, this is hard to answer, but this is your chance to really explore that concept. And so I think it's try to situate yourself through historical situations in New York City. Like when I teach about, we kind of talked about this in the earlier portion of the semester, but a lot of people who have not done socio-legal analysis, they think that immigrants live in the same neighborhood because they all like being around each other. Like there was some kind of magic message that was sent worldwide that said, come to South Flatbush, you're welcome here. Now, that's because sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes an uncle calls a nephew or something, right? And there's information that people get that they say this is a good place to live. But that doesn't explain how that group displaced the group before them. And so when we do a socio-legal analysis, one of the things we look at is geography. And so we see how different immigrant groups have taken over different parts of South Brooklyn over the last 100 years. And so you can kind of tell which immigrant group is kind of up and coming based on, have they moved up from South Brooklyn? Are they moving up towards kind of central Brooklyn and Manhattan? That tells you who's kind of got more power as an ethnic group in Brooklyn over the last 100 years. The other situation, though, is we look at laws, we look at gentrification, we look at zoning, right? It's not a coincidence that people are kind of forced to live in a certain area based on their economic status. And so that is often tied to their ethnicity in New York City. And so you want to think about that in your individuality, in your own standpoint. How do you relate to this system? Where do you live? What's your economic situation? How is that similar and different to other people? And then you want to think about your social relations as well. Are you a mother? Are you a daughter? Are you a sister, right? Are you an employee? Are you a student, right? All of these different, categories help define your point of view. And so that's where you kind of really want to start, is just kind of getting that theme kind of really well organized. That's a critical point of socio-legal analysis, is really understanding who you are in the system. It's then pretty smart to contrast to your opposite, right? So this can be done through the readings, right? One of the readings should give you information about someone who is different than you. And so you contrast yourself to that person to get a better idea of how you each experience the legal system differently. That it's not going to have the same benefits and serve you the same way it's going to harm or affect somebody else. At that point, you then want to look at the judicial precedents, look at the court cases, and stop thinking of those as neutral, or that they help everybody, or that they're all focused on equality, and understand that they protect and benefit some people, and they harm and exclude other people. And so you want to be able to now see, does that affect me? Have I been affected by this particular court case? Now, this can be, again, it could be a benefit, but it could also be, a mixed thing, right? So lots of people think, for example, that Brown versus Board of Education means that they get to go to an integrated school, but they don't, right? An integrated school would be one that represents the population, so it would be a majority of white people. So if you were at a truly integrated school, you'd be with a majority white population. And so if you're not at a majority white population school, then you're not really integrated. And so Brown versus Board of Education didn't help you. It didn't benefit you. So if you're at a diverse school, but that lacks white people, then you're being excluded from a different educational system. And then that would be based on who you are in the economic system in New York City. At that point, you'd hopefully now really have a clear idea of unequal power relationships, and you start to see that certain people get benefits in the system, and that every time they get one of those benefits, it excludes and harms other people, and you might be on one of those sides, right? You might be the one that's constantly harmed or excluded. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't alter your situation, but the system stays the same. So you're resisting, or you're trying to change, or you're going up against the system, or, right, you're benefiting it and you're just kind of going along with it and it's working for you. And another thing to mention is, I'll just give a very practical example that I hear from students quite often, is that a lot of times in this class I'll hear from women who identify as white but are recent immigrants. And they feel like they are benefited from the system because at this time they're benefiting from the system. But years later they'll email me or call me, or we'll see each other, out in the real world, and they'll say, wow, I just got discriminated against because of my accent, or because of where I was born, right? suddenly people are very anti-Russia now, right? So that could come up, and that didn't necessarily come up 5 or 6 years ago. And so your exclusion or your harm might not happen right now in this class. It might happen in the future. It might also have happened 10 years ago to you, right? So that's the kind of complicated part about understanding unequal power relationships, is that they change based on your experience, your age, all of these things. So you really want to think about institutional spaces like religious spaces, workplaces, where you live, what you define as your home, right? Your dating experiences, shopping centers and how you experience those places, when you travel, when you go from place to place, right? How did this happen, etc. Like the different places where there are different social norms and how those affect people differently. That's really kind of how you can apply a theme and then kind of stick to it. And I just gave the example here of just starting with your own standpoint, right? You could also switch this up and you could start with unequal power relationships and pick one of them, right? Like the workplace, and then follow that through and do kind of a similar approach. So this was for the students who were wondering about using the themes. So so does this help clarify how to use the themes?
Yes, it does.
Again, if there's any questions or you want to try out a theme, right, you can either do it verbally or you can do it in the chat.
Or if we come up with our own themes, as long as it has to do with the course content, that's okay too, right?
Yeah, and this goes back again. It's hard. Sometimes I wish I had a magic wand and I just say a sentence and everybody understands, right? So what makes a socio-legal analysis different is that you have to understand that your individuality is produced by your social relationships. And those are unequal social relationships. And so that's the main difference here, is that people are treated differently by the system based on their socially constructed individualities. And so that's what I'm trying to get you to be able to do, to analyze. And so a theme is just helping you do that. So if you come up with your own theme, it's perfectly doable as long as that's what you're showing me.
Okay.
Now, from a purely writing point of view, what the theme table over here to the right does is that you write in these boxes. So your main argument would be the first sentence. And so this would be related to your critical inquiry question, where you'd now be answering the question. So you'd say, the criminal justice system affects me as a XYZ, right? A white male of privilege, a black woman with children, right? You'd be very clear about who you are in the system, and then now you're describing how the system affects you. That's where you'd go to the next box, where you'd get the course material support. Which reading best supplies evidence for your argument, for the thing that you're putting forward? Then in your conclusion or analysis, that's where you're going to apply these terms, right? The polyvocality, the standpoint, judicial precedent. This is where you're going to really show me that you understand the social construction of individuality. And then I would wait for the solution until I did at least 2 themes. And then I'd look and see what's the main point that comes from those 2 rows. That's going to give me a hint as to what the solution would be for this particular inquiry that you've been, to the answer to your question, like the thing that you're kind of investigating or trying to understand. And again, just to remind you, the solutions would be open rebellion, violence, reform, right, which would be like legislation, or continued submission to the dominant structure. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Sorry that you kind of have to repeat, but I understand the main argument is like my first sentence, but and then the course material support would support what my main argument is.
You're asking whether the material would support your main argument?
Yeah, like I had to then the course material will support like my main argument. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so if I give you, so here's the example I would give you, right? Is that, let's say I was using Daisha's question about how the criminal justice system affects me as a white male with educational privilege, right? The first thing that jumps into my mind is that I'm going to be tempted in that situation to talk about my rights, because that's how white men are trained. And I would have a certain language and a certain ability to be probably pretty obnoxious in that relationship. So I would then think about Patricia Hill Collins, that reading, where she's talking about Polly Murray not being able to exercise her rights and being evicted from an apartment for being black. And so the course material would support my experience, and I'd be contrasting it to her experience and showing how rights don't affect everybody equally. Some people are empowered, some individuals are empowered, right? So my individual is not based on Jason, right? It's not based on anything I've done. It's based on the color of my skin and my gender. And so that's given me preference and privileges in this legal system that I was just born into, right? I didn't have to do anything to earn that. Whereas Polly Murray worked 10 times harder than I did and was excluded and harmed from the same system because of the color of her skin and because of her gender, right? So the course material is supporting my main argument that I experience the criminal justice system differently than other people.
See? Now I understand. Thank you.
And then I think, my conclusion would be, shit's not fair, right? And so then my analysis would be talking about some more of these things that I'd learned in class. I'd probably want to go to some of the cases and say, of course the system's not fair, right? Look at Plessy versus Ferguson. Look at Scott versus Sanford. Look at Miller versus California. There's all sorts of situations in which, like Makai said, the judges aren't neutral. They're very much biased and political. And so, one solution that jumps into my mind that I think, Professor Chapman has been talking about in policing class too is, to get rid of the summary judgment. Don't give judges so much power. Make every issue go to the jury. I don't know if that's practical. I don't think it's constitutional, but it is a solution, and it might work, right? Make juries have to decide every single legal issue, right? Don't give power to judges. Okay, I'll go to the next thing as you process that information. Now, this kind of goes back to the theme question, and I just, so how to do this? I start with something that's familiar to you, right? So if you've experienced racism, then you understand the theme of racism, right? It's well known to you. You can argue well using that theme. If you feel like a working class person, then you understand what that's like, right? That's a theme that you can work with. If you feel like you're a middle class person, you're gonna have to convince me, because most people are arguing that there's no such thing as the middle class. But if you feel like you are, then you must mean something by that, right? You must have some experience that makes you feel like you're in the middle class. That's different than working class people, and that's different than wealthy people. So you would want to use that theme of that experience. If gender is a meaningful category to you in workplace, like you feel like you get benefits or harmed based on your gender, at work, then that would be a good theme for you to focus on. But the key here is to just start with something that's really familiar to you, that you know really well. That's going to make this paper a lot easier. Then after you kind of have that sorted out, maybe write a couple sentences, go back through the readings and apply the theme, right? Probably the first time you read the reading, you were just trying to understand it. Well, now you understand it. So go back and look for it just from your theme. Like, what does it have to say about being disabled or able-bodied, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is a very interesting case for the disabled population, right? They are often segregated in educational settings. And so that seems to be in line with Plessy versus Ferguson. So judicial precedent seems to support the idea that students should be segregated based on their ability. That strikes us as being terribly unfair, right? As terribly discriminatory. And there's probably federal laws that say you can't do that. But here we have a conflict then between the courts and Congress. And so, if you have experience with being able-bodied, you should be able to, see how that benefits you. And if you have experience being differently abled, then you should see how that system harms you. And you'd be able to do that by looking at the readings. And then I think I'm really keying in here on is reasonably apply another theme, right? So once you've got one really good theme, stick with it, and then add a second theme. Add a layer or a dimension of analysis. This is basically to see what would the world be like from a different point of view. So if you're white, you would then apply the theme of race, right? Of what would it be like to be a person of color? Or if you're male, you'd think about what would it like to be a female, and then go back and reread those meetings with that theme. What does this reading have to do with gender? What does this reading have to do with race? This is how you kind of use the themes. And again, because they're unequal power relationships, the powerful have privilege, they benefit, and the powerless are oppressed, they are burdened, they're harmed. And that's true again in multiple situations: workplace, home, education, voting, right? Lots of different examples. Prison system.
Professor, so, for example, I would want to write about being a working class, and then you said to apply another theme, so then I could connect that to being a woman.
Right. And and you think about how being a woman in the working class is different than being a man in the working class.
Yeah.
But how being a man and a woman in working class are closer than being a man and a woman in the privileged class, where their roles. Oftentimes women work in workplaces with men as working class people. That becomes less likely as you move up in wealth. It's much more segregated, where they have men's work and women's work. Which again is counterintuitive, right? So, you're just showing your experience and then you're contrasting it to a different theme.
So like you just explained, I would also kind of have to give like the viewpoint from, like you were saying, like, a woman working in, wealthy, that are wealthy.
Yeah, and you again want to use the readings to support that,
Right.
right? So, I mean, one thing to think about is, both Bell Hooks and Patricia Collins had different experiences when they were young and then after they got their PhDs. So once they had privilege, race and gender impacts them differently than it did before they had privilege. Corinne, what do you think? I mean, this is the big question that scholars and people are debating right now. Here's how I define the classes, and then you could chime in, right? I used to advise small business owners. Almost all of them were in debt. So I kind of came to the conclusion while teaching that there are two classes in America. There are those who lend money, and there are those who owe money. And so if you're a business owner who owns a bank and you lend money, you're probably wealthy, right? But if you're a deli owner and you owe money, you're probably working class.
I mean, but eventually doesn't the business, like, you know, they pay off what they need to, like if they get a loan and then it's theirs. Since, you know, they're not rich, they can't pay it off in full.
Well, what's the question? I mean, you're correct. They don't pay it. Most businesses don't. Most businesses fail. Most businesses don't pay off their debts, right? I mean, even Donald Trump's businesses don't pay off their debts. Elon Musk's businesses don't pay off their debts. I mean, most businesses fail. Which now some of you are thinking, how on earth do you get rich? And, you have
yeah,
to,
how then?
Well,
wouldn't it be like generational then?
That helps, because here's the reality of it, right? And this goes to thinking about class and working class versus the wealthy. The working class, this is the language they use. This is the language we use, right? I use it less now because I'm, right, critical inquiry, and I think about it more. But we like to talk about making money, as if we're all sitting in our apartments printing money, right? Which is illegal, right? The wealthy don't talk about making money. They talk about taking money, because they understand what money is. Money is debt. And so they take wealth from the middle and the lower classes. But you see, the ideology is totally different. We're so used to thinking about working hard and making things, and so we think we're making money. But that's not possible. That's not a real thing. Only the Federal Reserve can do that. So we don't understand money is the problem. And the only way to become wealthy is to take property, whether it's cash, people, land, oil, water, chemicals, right? That's why all the best shows, right? Like Breaking Bad, all those, all those great shows where the criminals are getting ahead. You just compare that to the Industrial Revolution. It's just that now we demonize criminals, whereas in the Industrial Revolution we worship them. We were said, this is America, right? As Daisha said, right? So, this is what the other thing I was going to think of is like what's another counterintuitive thing that was really, really mind blowing for me, is that there's like a lot of students, right? I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, but the population was not a majority white. And so we didn't realize that there were other spaces where there was like 98% white population that we weren't allowed to go to. And then as you move up economically, if you get into some of the top higher economic spaces, those are incredibly diverse. They're not dominated just by white people. They're dominated by rich people, right? And that goes to generational wealth, right? That goes to so the color of your skin or your gender becomes less relevant the more wealth you have. And so this is why there was the myth of the middle class, was this magical space where everything was supposed to come together. There's just not any evidence that this has actually ever happened. So this is kind of, another way of thinking about this is like, how does your race and gender affect you differently when you're at home as opposed to when you're at school or when you're in the subway or you're at work or you go to a shopping mall, right? This is kind of, you're showing me now at this point you understand that the system is not universally neutral and fair all of the time, and that you can see that beyond just one point of view. Now, I will just say this because it's truth. In my 13 years of teaching, this is hardest for white males to do. Those students have the hardest time imagining the world from a different point of view. So something to think about. Now, some students asked about citations, so I just wanted to show you. Again, here is your resource library, right? Things you could draw from to provide your evidence. So I just put together 2 quick sentences using 2 resources to show you what a citation would look like. And I really emphasize using my own words, right? So I'm not copying and pasting and putting this in. So these are my words. So I noticed in the reading that social scientists used an experiment to show that black children were harmed when they received unequal education. And then this is how I would cite to it. And then Justice Marshall misread the Judiciary Act and established the precedent of avoiding political questions in the court, but created more political problems in society. Marbury versus Medicine. Now this is a perfect example because if you look on Google, it gives you the absolute wrong answer to this. And so I always know when you copied and pasted because it doesn't make any sense, because it says Justice Marshall's a genius, he started judicial review, all that's bullshit. That's not what happened, and all you have to do is read the case. But again,
Professor, so basically we should not be quoting like the text. We should put it in our own words and then just, parenthesize where we got it from.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Because again, you have to show me that you understand why this supports your argument.
Well, I mean, in like my other classes or like my English class, they tell you like quote it and then explain it. So that's what I.
But remember, that's because you're writing normative and formative papers in those classes.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay.
This class is you're analyzing, right? This is an upper level class, and so it's something that we don't talk about enough. Maybe I didn't mention it, but this class is also taught at John Jay, and so you're expected to be able to do the same things that John Jay students can do. And so this is a different level, or some people think it's harder. I don't think it's really harder. I think it's just different. Now, the reason why you do the citations like this is because they all come from the Law and Identity Reader. So I already know where they're coming from, right? You don't have to give me the whole idea. I mean, it's really, let me have a sermon for a second, right? The citation thing is really stupid in this generation because we all have hyperlinks now, right? So citations are just a monumental waste of our time. But before the internet, you had to literally go to the library, you had to go into this ridiculous box and you had to pull out a card and then go look up the thing. So that's where citations come from, right? It's if you cited to something and then I need to go look it up, I have to be able to find it. Right? So I'm avoiding all of that largely because this class is not about finding quote-unquote credible sources, because I've already given you all the credible sources. So I just need to know which one you're referring to. And then this is also showing me that you understand the material so that I feel better about, giving you an A. So Karen, right? Some people love it, some people hate it, but that's okay. Now this one, I think, this is like a cheat code. I don't really play video games, my niece does, and she tells me there's things called cheat codes. So this is like a cheat code for writing papers. Somewhere in your syllabus, or sometimes on the assignment sheet, they'll give you the learning outcomes. And so I'm helping you practice this, right? So here are the learning outcomes. I've translated them to be very concrete sentences. And then now I'm going to show you how do you write your paper using the learning outcomes. And then I'm also adding class resources and legal terms. So how do you bring these 3 things together so that the teacher knows that you totally understand the point of the class, which is going back to, Daisha asking, like, what if I wrote about what I learned? That's perfect. That is the genius thing to do. So this is how you do it. So I would just pick any random resource from that list and just write out a sentence and just practice. And so I just did this. Raven pushed back against Oprah to show that her ideas about legal rights were more important to her than social control as law. This was an example of law as a double-edged sword. So I would then go into race, gender, and class that was going on in that interaction. And then I would talk about why property is kind of important in that situation and who has more property, and so therefore who has more power between Oprah and Raven. And then I would talk about these processes of racism, and you could make relationships to homelessness, but you could also just talk about it as inequity. You could say, like the situation with student X, Raven is being stereotyped. So in both cases, they're being questioned, they're being devalued, and in some ways, right, in the situation with Oprah and Raven, Oprah is using the criminalization, right? She's using the concept that being gay is not okay against Raven, right? So she's using the laws at that time to kind of reduce her power. I would then try to break down the outcomes into pieces. So I kind of did this for you, right? So gentrification goes really well with the bell hooks reading. So if that's your theme or that's the thing that you're thinking about, those are two really good resources. Racial capitalism and Plessy versus Ferguson go really well together. They also go well with the doll studies, but I already used that in the previous example. Criminalization in the Miller versus California, that goes really well. And I also think that can also go to, rap lyric cases, video game cases, ways that people criminalize what they think is immoral behavior. And so you can kind of put those two together as a theme. And then there's the Najla Saeed and race, class, and gender identities and how those are fluid and how those change, right? So that's another way you could just look at the readings and try to combine them with a theme, and then you use that to construct a sentence that shows me that you can apply the learning outcomes. The final way I would think about it is think about these three things as questions you need to answer using the learning materials. So they're kind of like quote-unquote discussion questions. So you do the reading and you say, so in what way did this reading talk about property and constitutional rights? In what way did this video, I'm thinking of the uneven growth video, how did that show that New York City values property over human rights? In what ways does Miller versus California show that criminalization can lead to all sorts of other social problems? And then I would say, how do you think about the balance between social control and rights talk? And so those are ways of answering those questions. And you'll see now we're coming full circle, right? You're now doing the same thing you did with answering the inquiry question. And that's basically how you do analysis of any kind, whether it's with the psychologist or whether it's on a college paper. And then finally, I put a glossary of legal terms on Blackboard to help you hopefully think through some of those. It would be good to use a few that really stand out to you and that you feel like you know really well. Don't use them wrong, right? But if one stands out and says, wow, this totally explains what I'm trying to say, use that legal term. And that's kind of, a bonus icing on the cake kind of thing to show that you definitely understand the learning outcomes because you're able to use the language. Are there any questions for writing for learning outcomes? Or comments?
Yes, I have a comment. So while we're doing, so it goes with the theme, and then what I'm trying to ask is, so we have to put the learning outcome in the paper that we're writing. We can't exclude it. It has to be, it's one of the things that we have to write, right?
It's so hard to answer this question well, so I'm going to try my best. When a teacher puts together a class, right? So when I put together the class, we're required to come up with learning outcomes, and those we have to make based on the program learning outcomes. And so that's how we design the entire course. And this is if you do it yourself like I do, or if you use a textbook, you still have to think about how all of these things relate to those learning outcomes. So if a student is able to answer in a way that addresses the learning outcomes, it's like you're kind of getting into my brain too. And so it's much easier for me to see that you understand the material. If you don't talk about the learning outcomes, or if you don't seem to show that you understand them, it's really hard for me to get into your brain and try to figure out what did you mean by what you're writing. So the learning outcomes are kind of the way that we organize the entire process and the information. So it's not like, you don't say something like, Raven pushed back against Oprah through a property-first constitutional narrative that reinforced social exclusion. Like, you don't do that, right? It's not like that. It's mostly looking over and saying, okay, I get that the U.S. Constitution protects property rights instead of human rights. And so the situation in Patricia Hill Collins, when she writes about Polly Murray not being able to get an apartment, that's an example of the legal system protecting property over Polly Murray's human rights. So you show me you understand that, it's like you're in my brain, and it shows me that you're understanding the course in the same way. That's why I call it a cheat code, honestly, right? If you can do that with every one of your classes on papers, the only situation it wouldn't work is if the teacher doesn't actually understand the learning outcomes themselves. But if they understand the learning outcomes and they organize the class, they're going to see you reflecting what they wanted you to learn in the class. For me, this is just what's required in the criminal justice program, is you need to understand these three concepts. And so the concepts are criminalization. In other classes you might have learned it as like labeling theory, but I've given you now, you see how labeling theory applies to a real situation, and that's homelessness, right? So homelessness is created because of criminalization. Right, so rights consciousness is the fancy phrase that they use at higher level classes, but a double-edged sword is a good metaphor, because on one side of the sword it's got domination and social control, but the other side of the sword is rights consciousness and freedom, or rights talk and freedom. And so these are things that you have to learn in order to move on through the program, for those of you who are criminal justice students, which is most of you, right? And so that's how we organize the course. And hopefully there's overlap with other professors like Professor Chapman, Barnaby, Trotman, McMorris, Seward, right? We talk about these things. Okay, for time I'm going to go to the next thing. This is like probably the silliest slide, but I think it might be the most useful, right? When you're organizing a college essay, this is what I always think of. I remember reading this story when I was a little kid, and I looked at this picture and I thought, genius, right? Look at all these boxes. Look at how everything's labeled. I'll be able to find everything so quickly. Now, I doubt I did this as a kid, right? But I remember thinking, that'd be nice, right? That'd be a system where I knew where everything was. That's what a college paper is. It's that closet. Everything is very clear and easy to find, and that means that you are the one who has to organize it. You have to take all the messy ideas, all the different pieces of paper, all the work you've done, and now you have to organize them into nice, organized boxes. And so that's why I say start with what you know, right? Obviously with this little bear, puzzles is what she knows. And so start with whatever it is that you know the best from this class and stick with that. Then write, put it down, go do something fun, come back, write again, go eat lunch, come back, edit, and then finally rewrite one more time to make it as organized as you possibly can and as clear as you possibly can, and try to eliminate as many errors, right? Because errors make it hard for me to understand what you're trying to say. I think it's helpful to make a little very quick outline of the class concepts. But don't look at that and go back and forth. right? It's not like a checklist where you're trying to make sure you get every single concept into the paper. Sometimes students do that, and it's the total mess of a paper. It's just that if you get stuck on something, if you're trying to explain something, you look over at your outline and you say, this is what I'm trying to say, right? This is the concept I'm trying to explain. I have it in my outline, right? And that doesn't have to be a big, long, complicated outline. It could be one page. I usually call it a cheat sheet, right? You just have one page where you've just got your main ideas. Refer to that as you're writing your paper when you get stuck. Now think of your syllabus as a checklist, right? Like I said, I put information in an order that I thought would lead you up to this point. So you'd be able to write this paper based on all of the activities and readings up to this idea, up to this point. So you want to look for the main ideas from each week, right? One main idea would be great from each week, and just see, okay, what story is this class telling? That's the story you're trying to tell back to me about what you learned. You don't have to have learned everything to get an A in this class, right? Not everybody's going to learn everything. Very few students are going to learn everything, but you're going to learn most of the things. And so you're just showing me what you know, and so that's why you need to keep the essay true to you. It should be a reflection of what you know and what you understand in your own words. So it shows me how you learned the class. So I expect to get 25 different papers, not 25 papers saying the same thing. I forgot to get the song out, but there's that John Mayer song. Some of you will ask me, how many pages does this need to be? Say what you need to say. If that takes you 7 pages, then it needs to be 7 pages long. If it takes you 4 pages, then it needs to be 4 pages long. Right? It needs to be as long as you need. It shouldn't be 12 pages. That would be too much. But it kind
Is there a minimum? And does it need to be like double spaced, or like that doesn't really matter?
Let me, so this is my answer. So I think the minimum, I think you'd have to have, a couple of you might be able to write this paper in 4 pages based on the work you've done so far. Again, if you followed all my advice, you're super organized, right? You've got to the main point, you might be able to write this in 4 pages. I think most of you probably need to write 6 to 7 pages. A couple of you are long-winded, and that's okay. And so you'll write like 9 pages. But probably the average, I bet, will be around 5 to 6 pages based on my experience. It really depends on how organized you are. Like I said, if you pick one theme and you stick with it, and you've been really organized all class, or you get really organized between now and when it's due, you'll probably be at 4 pages. Now, this is just a draft due next week, so if you're only at 3 pages or 2 pages or 1 page, that's okay. Email that in. Or if you have 12 pages and you say, I need help getting this smaller, I can help with that too. I mean, this is just a way of making sure that you're staying on task, that you're doing the work necessary so that you can have the best possible final draft to get the best possible final grade. And my goal for next week would be you're able to come to this session on Wednesday, check in with me, and ask any questions that are still remaining, and then you go back and you finish your paper. And then you just email me, sometime during next week. Are there any questions?
So, we can't still, screen share our outline, can we?
Yes.
Because I know last week you said, create the outline that make an outline for next week, and come with it.